Hi, everybody. Another Thursday, and we have a few questions. Um, I hope everybody is doing okay and trying to be cool and relaxed a bit. Intensity is one of the things that gets us really charged up. And before I start on questions, um, one of the most profoundly talked about by those who have really been involved with something a little deeper than the surface of so-called spirituality is dealing with uh, so-called ego thing, which of course we all have. And they don't really talk about it in kind of a classical term. They talk more about biases and how difficult it is to break through the biases that we all have, and how the biases are created by habits that we've all been involved with in our lives. And these are habits of being risky. I'll risk this maybe, um, of things you do, how you think about things, how you decide what you think is more valid than anybody else's way of thinking, how you have not been looked at well, how you've been, from your perspective, manipulated and moved around and admonished, even run into difficult times in terms of during the creation of your personality, which is often called the ego, um, which is just a form that helps you to survive in the world. And everyone has one. I don't care who you are, you've got one. The dilemma with this is that when we write books and write materials, we write in a fashion that relates to the biases we have. This is consistent everywhere. If you could actually understand that, then for you and your sake, you could say, well, let me think about this. Is there a way to think about this or that, whatever it is you're thinking about, slightly different than the biases that I have? Now, what that does is tries really to help you to understand that you do have biases, and they may be valid, they may not be. So the next statement that I'd make on that is that all biases are on a continuum. It means from the very most coarsest way of looking at things to the most subtle, wondrous, marvelously, fantastically valid idea. So all the way, it's like a slide. And we go up and down this slide. We never reach anywhere close to higher state consciousness. I hope everybody heard that. But you may believe you do. And that's on the continuum. That's a bias. And it's not a negation. It's an observation. It brings in the idea of, much to the chagrin of almost anyone that's rational, the idea that being rational cannot figure out higher states. However, it's been tried and it will continue to be tried. And there's a purpose in trying that. If there are hundreds of thousands of books out there that give an opinion about something, that is considered to be a relative rationale of how a person considers things to be. This is normal in our world. They're not negative. They're just a rationale, an option. In the mental sphere, in the brain itself, we call mind up here, mind, thing. There is a way of connecting this, with our emotions, with the way we think things have to be, with what we believe sincerely in our heart, whatever it may be, that relates to our personality. I'm bringing in these chakra things, root, gonad, and solar plexus, which brings force in and allows us to make thoughts, bring into our ability to engage with life an idea. This is how we develop. Ultimately, that emotional engagement, emotional and mental rationale, which is self-protective and needs to be for the purpose of survival, becomes not withering, but quieter, because there is a level of mind that in a way is cultivated to be quiet. There's a quiet cultivation where after everything that you believe has to be true, there's an expression of almost a questioning. And I'll do this in an obvious way. Well, what do you think? Is there another way to look at this? We don't do it that way because we're still focused on our bias about how important we are in the scheme of things. But we do it in a kind of interesting way. As the emotional bias can be quieted, we begin to be open to considering something beyond the belief that is current in any culture, any small grouping of people of, let's say, 10 billion people agree with something, small grouping. Oh, sorry, there's only 8 in our world. Oh, let's try a million then. Okay, 10 million people agree with something, so therefore it must be right. 350, 300, 400 million people agree with something. Therefore, it's the only right thing that must be true. This is borderline nonsense. But it's a place from where you can move. It's like this computer. If you put your hand on a computer, if you're looking at a computer, there's a flat part and then there's a visual part. You're looking at a visual part, perhaps, or on a TV screen. But there's a flat part. You can feel it. Your sensory system tells you that you can feel how that computer is. Your sensory bias tells you that this must be valid because 389 or whatever million people agree with you. That is the exact way that life occurs. That is why we cannot grow very quickly. But that is why we're steadily growing as a process. We steadily do this. Yes, well, we live 100 years or 80 or whatever years, and a whole new group of people come in and they say, oh, we don't want to think like those old guys thought. Let's come up with new ideas. And there's always a coming together of ideas from generation to generation to generation to generation. These are only ideas. They're not links with a higher state. The cultivation and the willingness to allow yourself to come up with an idea is slightly different. If it happens to make some sense in relationship to another state, is not how we think, but it is how we grow. It's a dilemma, but we will continue to have that dilemma for a vast number of years, unless our perception allows us to enter into a timeline that is experiential, refinedly so, in a refined manner, something that we can allow ourselves to grab onto with at least a curiosity about what could be possible. Is it actually possible to become consciously aware of another state? It's a very reflective question. If you're sitting on top of your bias and you already believe it's not possible, then you will go to every single piece of research you can find and make some sense out of that research and come up with an idea. That is not what I'm talking about, although that's not a bad exercise. It's an exercise that will teach you something about how we learn and understand things, and how those who have come up with ideas that are different and therefore moved our process on have not thought like that, but considered material like that. That opened them to try and broaden out what their biases were because they were doing research. They didn't always believe the research, and they didn't always believe themselves. That's what biases are about. There's a defense of all biases that we have. You have to leave room for a reality that might be different than the biases you have. Your biases are not reality, they're beliefs. That is true of everything. And that is a must that we are a part of in our engagement with life, in our engagement with each other, until there is an imposing engagement of a higher state into the brain that is being quieted down because it's an mentally oriented mental structure, where you learn stuff, you add stuff, you remember the stuff that you added in there, and you continue on and you build like building a bridge. It's very similar to the old biblical concept of with respect to languages. And it wasn't language, it was verbal interaction. It was intellectual engagement. You can believe you know what God looks like, if there is a God, and you believe there is. You can also believe you know what that must look like. And everyone involved with that must be this way versus that way. That's an alignment with biases. Along a continuum, we're still on coarser levels. We can't perceive an energy field that is actually loving. It lies inside ourselves. We can't even allow that to happen because we'll be too vulnerable to almost anything and everything. We have to attend to what's here in these planes. The old Christian orientation, give unto Rome what's Rome, is for Rome. Give unto God what's God's, or higher states is God's. And when you're in the world of Rome, and that's your major focus, and that's your major validation, with all due respect, that often is ours as normal human beings, You can't flip the coin. You can't flip it. When you flip it, it's going to look like the same thing. You flip, but it's still the same way. You're biasing what that must be like. This is normal. So you can see how difficult this might be for us normal folk when we're trying to engage with higher states. Well, for a long time, I've tried to support the idea that you can begin to perceive energy flowing in through you and around you. I use chakras or Sephiroth, or I don't care what it is that you use. Valves, I've often talked about that. The energy comes in through, and that's a kind of loving in a particular way, but it comes through those valves, and you use that energy with all its biases. You've created yourself with those biases. That loving aspect has given you that love or intensity relative to you, not relative to anybody else, relative to you. So you are you relative to you. So you then are entitled to have biases. You have an entitlement. You will act the way you act because that's the way it is, the same for everybody. Now, how do you soften that down? Well, there is a constructed system. This is just a view. It happens to be mine. How right this is, how wrong this is, not relevant. To me, it's as valid because I have experience in these things. Until you have experience in these things, even if you say you do, and don't understand the premise behind it, then you're going to elevate your biases, your position and place in the world. It's not relevant. Being consciously aware of the structure of reincarnation and karma is only being conscious of this structure of reincarnation and karma the way you have learned to read it. There is nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't mean it's real. The first time you have an experience of another lifetime that's real, here's what happens. It links with you. And you then see that lifetime not as being special because you had a really titled lifetime. Not for that reason. You look at the lifetime to see how you can engage with this one differently because of the difficulties you had in that lifetime. Not only difficulties from a perspective, good, bad, right, or wrong, just under a set of circumstances, this may happen. Be careful, it could happen again. This kind of thing. How were you in that particular? I'll give you one of mine as a Buddhist Lama, and at a time I met my old friend from that time. I make no bones about it. He is still a Lama. He's from Tibet, and he is teaching and doing a bang up job teaching what he's doing. In that one, I was frustrated, honestly, with a few people who had great capacity, and they were doing their level best to try and soften down how important they were because they were doing their thing. And with all due respect, at the same time, I was doing my best trying to get them to soften that down so that they could shift and move into a different state. And I didn't do that well. I did it rather badly. I was trying to push them into it. Well, I have to admit, I don't know if I've expanded that. As a matter of fact, I think I might have gone down the hill under some of those circumstances, because I would still love to have people, very selfish on my part, to be able to talk to about a state that has nothing to do with what you have to believe here to be right. Yeah. Don't even know what that means from time to time. Just know I can perceive that frustration internally from an old time, and I'm still working with that. So you might say, well, you might have been a lemon another time and you were a great lemon. You weren't as bad as I was. You were hardly even having a personality. You were just helping people, and they understand how wonderful that you were and all the rest of the stuff, which is just nonsense. The dilemma with this is we are not the physical form only. We have an internal form. They're not separate. They lie within one another. We come in here and we learn how to deal with these timelines, because thankfully our parents will say, you should do this, should do that, do that. If you do all of this, you won't be like me and all the difficulties I've had. You'll be an extra special this and that of another person. And they don't do that well. And we don't really handle that well. So we, in our own way, we make up our own biases. The problem is we don't perceive what they're like. That's our difficulty. So there's very important time that can be spent on watching and observing our relationship with us. Not to find out negative things, not to find out wondrous positive things, although sometimes these things are helpful in making us get through a day, whatever that means. But just to watch it like you're sitting in a bloody theater and you're watching, you're part of the territory, and here you are up on a screen and you're playing the way you play it every day. And suddenly you realize, wow, those things are in charge of me. I act them out because this has been my habit over 40, 50, 30, and 20 years, whatever. How many years you might have practiced doing you. And you're practicing, but you're not interested in doing anything differently. Yet you are, because there's that part in you that is an actual spiritual part. Call it what you would like, a growing part that is in love with growing. It has a touch of love in it that is tremendous. It can't just play outwardly, because in our world, if you play that outwardly too much, you're going to be very vulnerable to all energies coming into you, including the species will want you to be exactly like what you should be in the coarser levels, not broadening out along a continuum to more subtlety. There's nothing wrong with our species. It's the nature of our species. Wherever it is on its growing continuum, wherever our characteristics, whatever they may be, on a continuum, wherever they are related to a thing called karma and reincarnation. You're moving towards a point where there can be a semi-balance for this time, so that there can be an interacting higher state within the bias state, while the bias is quiet and looking at what's happening even there, and realizing that there is a thought form And it's not like an intuitive nature that has a bias towards doing something, which we could all have. In other words, my intuition tells me this, blah, 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 blah. It's a projection of your biases normally that tell you that. When this other state tells you, and intuition's a good word, insight, intuition, because if there is truly an insight, it will be different than what you believe should be valid. And slowly, there's a broader engagement with that, but it still lives in the coarser level, relatively speaking. It slides along. You have a reaction, slides back down into the normal stuff that you've been trained with. That's a karmic range. Also, there may be different frequencies that come into you, and in that karmic range, there is let's say, a newer frequency than what you're normally used to do in past incarnations, and you're not doing as well with it as you did with other frequencies, because in those times you were validated by other frequencies because you could handle them better. In this one, not doing as well, don't know how to balance them off. They're focused on your own self-interest, and it validates you more than validating an engagement with the higher state for the good of others. At service orientation that all religious backgrounds are involved with, at least to some degree, is the key. Now, that service orientation being the key also involves with learning how, over a huge timeline, how to engage with frequencies and not engaging with your biases at the same time, because you know consciously, you perceive that you have experienced that flow, and it is moving in through and helping others, through you and helping others to become slightly more perceptive than they could be before, which raises all kinds of questions in their mind. They are, in our world, trained to be judgmental automatically. My God, surely all of you have seen how judgmental you can be. Something happens, judgmental. About what? About how they are, whoever they are, about yourself, about somehow along that continuum of judgmentalness, if that was such a word, there you are, that's where you sit. Even if you have energy and are quite able, you can still have your personality bias. A gentleman that I knew quite reasonably over a period of time in India, who was a guru, has a perspective. And that perspective, whatever it would be, doesn't matter what it is, covers the whole of his relationship with being a guru. And it's biased towards his personality, way of thinking things. This is not a negation. This is, and the individual is an instrument in the movie that you can watch to understand that an idea that you have about something can get a hold of you and just grab you and pull you in, and you're not open to anything else. We don't have to look very far for that one. All of us have been affected by this one in any way of engaging with life. Surely you have come up against this, where someone thinks something and they truly think it's the only way to think. That's why all these books are written this way. They're written so that you can learn this may be true, that may be true, this may be true, this may be true, this may be true. And you say, no, I like that one better. So your bias is focused on one without experience about the very thing that you're talking about. I think this is the most normal thing in our world, and I think this is difficult for us to move past. And I'm not sure that we can move past it quickly. I think as we move through a deeper understanding, and deeper meaning more awareness understanding, more conscious awareness, more experiential awareness, we will begin to slowly notice that some of the things that we may believe might be perfectly true may not be true at all, but it won't matter. And that's one thing that we have to learn. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. That's a piece or a pebble on a road that we have and we walked on and over and through, but we're not going to negate that past. It's just a byway towards a different angle than we used to have in seeing something beyond what we can see now. This is a must in all spiritual growth. It's a dilemma because we're trained to have memories. And these memories are there and we remember them, and therefore we're elevated by those memories. And the memories on what you've read, what you speak, what you engage with, and what you believe must be true. This is a dilemma. Hang on. It's a dilemma, but it's not insurmountable. It's just a part of an engagement with broadening and learning. For example, if there are many frequencies, by the way, not only 7 or 8 or 9 or whatever, there are many subtle frequencies, and some of them interact together, and they work together in a conglomerate of frequencies to engage with us in different levels so that we could function differently and be helped somehow. Well, this is for another time if you're ever interested. But the interactions with different frequencies are there to help us to come together at some point with links of past times where we had little clusters of lives come together to handle a particular frequency better. This is a little odd compared to some ways of seeing things, but this is really important in the process of handling frequency for the purpose of being able to be helpful in a timeline that might be 3 or 4 timelines down the road, or 1 or 2, who knows, depending on your journey through you, and the help that you can handle and receive based on how much can you take in that's different than what you believe must be true because you're the one who's believing it. This is not so simple. However, it is a process. So any ways of looking at things are part of the process. Coming into a state where you can either sense, touch, see, hear, whatever, the engagement with that flow, so that the individual who has reached that stage is less important than the actual flow is moving through it. That is the reason for reincarnation. To be able to have enough clusters of lives that can handle frequencies through timelines so that it can let go, and watch and see and perceive, as opposed to having to have a reaction to whatever it's perceiving so it can validate itself. Sounds complicated, but it's not. It's wondrous. And the most wonderful thing about it is that it's all based on a deep inner love that flows all the time and wants you to be helpful to you. Is trying to help you to be helpful to you, not to be helpful to your idea of having things to be this way versus that way. But if that is the way you are looking at things, then basically that's what you will see. And it will validate you for a time. Eventually, it will make you feel uncomfortable. Learning how to soften that discomfort down is, one could say, you learning how to deal with you. But at the same time, your focus on your bias pulls that love or intensity towards making your bias stronger until even you don't agree with it. This is not a negative thing, by the way. This is the nurturing of a thought that is different than the thoughts you already have. Because fortunately for us, our system is made up so we can actually think on these coarser levels down here. And sliding that form over here, a you form, a me form, any other form, helps you to begin to take a look at things slightly differently without negating this. Although the opportunity to negate this is a reflex to remain the same. Strangely enough, it's like coming to grips with a concept called zero or infinity. Very difficult thing to do if you're, depending on how you look at it. So this question was precipitated by Michel Laramie, and he talks about so many different people having so many different points of view. And I totally agree with him. There's all kinds of stuff out there. And I don't negate the stuff that's out there. People are, it's really interesting. Take a look at this from a different point of view. There's a whole bunch of people who don't even think about spiritual stuff or these ideas of reincarnation and karma. And they work together. They're very positive, in my opinion. Rather than a negative perspective, I look at it from a positive point of view. They're constructed systems so that we can ultimately develop a form that can handle a flow coming into us that we couldn't handle before because we didn't have any practice doing it. And the subtlety of a continuum of course to infinity is mind-blowing. Tremendous levels of love, from self-love right up to a loving of something where there's no self at all. It's just all loving. It's a huge continuum, but so are all the other continuums that exist in our relationship with life. Whatever it is that you have, doesn't matter. I can be the greatest critic in the world. Oh yeah, there's a continuum. From the coarser criticism to the criticisms that might be helpful to another. So it's a very broad way of looking at something in a positive way. So that's my preference. And there are some who have not written books who kind of agree with that preface, uh, because they know to write these books won't make very much difference at all, because there's a whole lot of thoughts that are already strongly affirmed, definitions that are strongly affirmed. If you check, all of us, check your definitions. They're strongly affirmed by you. It's okay. They may or may not be as valid as you believe, but they're nonetheless affirmed. And that's how we do our kind of, it induces us to reason in a particular way. Has a tendency to affirm ourselves and our own self-interest. But anyway, I've tried to answer that, I think, the best I can from my perspective. Any incarnations that I have honestly perceived, they've always been there to show me this is how I did something before that might be helpful to learn from that. I tend to look at it from that point of view, simply because my relationship with those things is related to this life. I'm remembering from there. Therefore, if I was arrogant in one life, I would try not to be as such in this one better than I could before. If I had a sense of one way of looking at things, I would try and see if I could do that slightly different. It's not always easy to do, but it is valuable to do it, because in fact, you're dealing with frequencies internally that would be perhaps a little more balanced or softer. And sometimes that'll really work for you, and sometimes it'll work less. But you will come to the aid of the values that you place on yourself. This is a natural way to do things in the world of coarser nature. And we are in that world. No matter what people think, it's still a part of that. And we're trying to blend another level of another, let's say, dimension or another state, and know that it's real, as opposed to thinking is just another intellectual rationale that we can come up with to suit the needs we have to engage with life so that we feel more comfortable, whatever that means. I don't quite see it from that point of view. I see it from a different point of view. I just take a look here, if you don't mind, Michelle, just to see if I made a couple of notes. Hopefully I didn't leave anything out. Yeah, it's karma. I did leave that. Karma is kind of a register of how you deal with frequency, and so that you won't forget it in your journey towards being able to deal with different frequencies in a more subtle way. That doesn't sound negative to me at all. Could it be that, for example, I gave one example, somebody cut me off on the highway one time on my way to somewhere, and I was grumbly about that. I said, "What? You almost put me in the ditch." And about 3 or 4 miles on, after this person was long gone, I passed a person, and I was for sure I had all kinds of room in the back. And I put my blinker on and put over, but the person behind me has speeded up. This is natural when somebody is passing you. There's a reflex to speed up, strangely enough, but it often happens. And even though I was safe and in there, I kind of cut him off as well. And I said, it's more about me grumbling about the person who probably felt the same way as I did when I passed this next person. And so it was kind of a reality check for me. You never know what's in the mind of another. They may be thinking of the fact that they didn't do that on purpose or something, but we use our biases to assess the situation. That makes us feel like there's some value to it. And in fact, most times there's a lot less value than we think there is. Okay, and we make up our own rules is another thing based on ideas that are better than somebody else's ideas. And we do this all along. Just think of in the Christian mode, Jesus walks in and he's engaged with a whole bunch of people, and everybody who has ideas about something else grumbles about the fact that how he has no right to talk like that. Well, fortunately, it wasn't quite like that in Krishna's time and Buddha's time and a lot of other people's times, but it's just examples of things. And when you're thinking of reincarnation, think positive. How can you do what you can to help you to learn about how you function and maybe shift a little bit just so that you're learning from you. You're helping you to learn. You are in the custody of yourself, as I am, as others are. And sometimes we do pretty well, and sometimes not so much. It's how it works in our world. I wish you well, Michelle. Very, very good questions. And you might want to consult. There's a few talks back. I talked about reincarnation before. You might have missed that one, or you might not have. You might have been curious about the idea that why so many people have so many different perceptions. Some are just alignments with beliefs. Some are based on their experience, which may be different than another person's experience. And others write because they believe that their view of writing helps them to learn and understand, and they want to make a name for themselves. And that's all legitimate in our world. There's no negation in this. It's all real. So I wish you well with that one. My goodness, time flew with that one. Thank you. So here's another one, just to talk a little bit about this. Natalie Taylor wrote, she had some trouble with agitation. It was quite physical. When I look for the energy, it seems to be in the throat and root center, as well as brow and solar plexus. There is also stronger energy than before going up the back. By the way, just so you'll know, this is not uncommon now. Many of you are experiencing these things. And energy is getting a little bit stronger. And if you can, allow yourself to remind yourself about using some of these energy exercises to, in a soft way. You have to try and remind yourself, as soft as you can, remind yourself to use the exercises to try and soften down the biases that you've already had, the construction work of the personality that's already in effect. In fact, what happens is the root gonad and solar plexus are used along with other aspects of the upper, so-called upper centers, and they are used for the purpose of engaging with our world. It's like a platform that we live with. And these things, before the upper centers take strong hold and move out of the reach of the initial engagements with root gonad and solar plexus, what happens is that the upper centers, as they move out, they start to send energy back to the lower ones to broaden out. Most people who have written about these chakras have talked about the lower being root gonad, solar plexus, and the upper ones, the heart, the brow, the crown, the throat, the complex throat center, which is in the back and the front and moves up higher into a higher state. Because they talk about it like it's gradations of levels of movement that apply to the personality's value. And I'm not talking about that way. I'm talking about it in relationship to being able to handle energy moving through you, holding back and softening down your reactive states the best you can. You will not be able to do that perfectly well. No one does. Just so you'll know. But you will do it differently than, or you will do it the same way as you had all your life, and you will get a bigger charge because those three centers are trying to maintain a certain way of engaging with life that is reminiscent of how you constructed your personality from the time of your birth. This is quite natural. This is normal. This is what we do every single day of our lives. You're protective, you're engaging, you're trying to make sure that things remain the same. You don't want to shift and change. Even if you want to shift and change, you want to do it the way you believe it should be done. This is natural and normal. Isn't the way it works, but it's natural and normal. If that is the way you believe it has to be, energy will follow thought in that way and hold you in a place that you believe is protective enough to keep you in a spot that makes you feel comforted, not because you're comfortable, but because it's normal for you. And that is difficult because most times people don't know what's normal for them. And that's okay. Nobody does very often. We see ourselves from a different perspective than how we are. We see what we need to see for the purpose of understanding an engagement with images that we have solidly been involved with, and we want to maintain those images of ourselves. And I see nothing wrong with that, except if you're moving in a direction that relates to being more subtle, more engaging with another state, then you perhaps might consider the possibility that that is also on a continuum where, let's say, this area here on a long process of tremendous development to a oneness that's way beyond our understanding. We can intellectually talk about it, but it's not there for our experience. But over here, in the coarser levels, there's a broadening of those coarser levels, and everything that was there previously in this area here, our personality, gets stronger until we can learn to soften it down, and then we shift here because we believe somehow and have been somehow taught that you being important as a personality, intenser and stronger here, means that you're more spiritual. It's not real. But there is an adaptive aspect to that, where you try to adapt your intensity to the point of being a tiny bit softer so that you can allow yourself to perceive a little more of what's in that pocket here that helps us to survive in our day-to-day. Slowly, no disrespect, no negation, just trying to be helpful in a way to ourselves to try and allow ourselves to soften down a bit. This is very difficult. Intensity can grab you. And when you are intense in your natural, normal sensing modalities, in your personality, then there's always a reason for that. And that's always somebody else's fault. It's not. They may stimulate you, but you're the one with the reaction. This is very difficult for us normal folk. It's very difficult for many of the yogis that I've met in India as well. They try to hide it. They try smiling. It helps a little bit because I think there must be some kind of a gland in there when you start smiling and practicing smiling. You start feeling a little bit better. So there's a little bit of chemistry that when you practice doing certain things helps you. And I think that that's partly true, actually. But if you're only doing that to live up to an image that you need to have, then somewhere along the line, you start noticing that there's different responses in there other than the one that you're projecting. Physically, emotionally. There's ones that are in the inside. And those are the ones that you're trying to soften down and be respectful of and be kind to. I think that's just about all the time we have. And in Natalie's question, she's relating to that, and she's wondering about the intensity relating to that kind of shock line. You know, the small center, you know where the chest is? There's a small center in that upper part of the solar plexus. And there's one, it comes like a little bow and it goes upward around the back, roughly around the bra strap. I don't have one of those straps, so I can only guess. And there's a band of energy that can be, it's like a buffer zone, so that tremendously harsh energy that you might not think is harsh can't hit into the chest level that might hurt you. And the system is kind of set up that way. It's not talked about very much, but nonetheless, there it is. And it does come on, and it can be a little uncomfortable, but there's always a tiny little bit of energy that can get through. And it moves its way often up the back towards the neck area, then comes around from the back into just above the eyebrows, shifts into the brow a bit, and then starts regulating itself towards the top of the head. And there's also at the same time a small stimulation of the upper center. And you may notice it at the sides here, roughly these two places where you put your thumbs, and you'll find them tender from time to time. Those two little spots, but it's off the body where that's happening, not in the body itself. Patience. It's not about being good, bad, right, or wrong again. It's about, I see that. Okay, all right. I'm like that sometimes. That's it. End of it. Well, that's easy for me to say, end of it, but it's not always the end of it for me because I'm a human being. It's not always the end of it for Natalie or anybody else. Learning how to talk yourself down the best you can is important. And doing the pump slowly, softly, and the hands around the upper part of the chest softly, curving those hands around. Everything gentle. Subtle is stronger than brute strength. It's not what we're trained to think, but it is. Has a bigger impression. In our day-to-day with people, probably doesn't have that much impression, but on another level, has a big impression. I wish everybody well. I hope everybody is doing well and continue to do very, very well. Please take care of yourselves. We'll talk to you next week. Bye for now. We're going to do a meditation now. Sorry about that.